Okay, tonight we are reading Frankie Fish and the Sonic Suitcase, Chapter 17, The Big Race. Grandad and Frankie managed to find two seats overlooking the final corner. The infamous corner where Alfie Fish lost control of his beloved machine before it careered into the wall. Frankie was so nervous that he felt like he'd swallowed a jar full of bees. As the smell of engines and gasoline danced around Frankie Fish's nose, the racetrack's loudspeaker buzzed and crackled to life. Untimely and unexpected grey skies overhead won't dull the thousands of fans who've floated to the track today to see the much-anticipated big race. I haven't been this excited since my wife allowed me to eat black pudding in my undies on my birthday, but that is probably too much information for now. Many believe the big race is down to just two competitors, Clancy Fairplay and Alfie Fish. A roar rose from the crowd when the commentator mentioned Alfie Fish's name. Little did anyone know there were two Alfie Fishes at the track that day, young Alfie in race car number 42 and Grandad Alfie, who was watching with his grandson in the grandstand. And what a grand occasion it was. It's super weird to hear the crowd cheering for Grandad, thought Frankie, almost like hearing the students at St. Monica's cheering and whooping for Principal Dawson at assembly. The crowd had the exact opposite reaction to Clancy Fairplay's name being announced. There was moderate applause sprinkled with boos and jeers and some rude Scottish words that can't be printed in a nice book like this. The commentator's voice became more excited. Mark this date down in history, lads and lassies. Today will be remembered as the birth of the famous sporting rivalry. In years to come, when people talk about motorsport, they won't be able to avoid talking about Fairplay versus Fish in the big race. There is no doubt about it. Today will be a classic. Grandad's knee was shaking like a leaf stuck to a milkshake machine in an earthquake. Frankie tried to stop it by covering it with his own hand, but unfortunately Frankie's hand was shaking too, so it was of no help at all. Frankie glanced upward at the sky. The rain seemed to be holding off, but for how much longer? In his short life, Frankie had been nervous many times, like when they dissected a frog in a science exam, or when he performed as a wise man in the nativity play. But there was the time he'd had to tell his dad about the D he received for his biology project about electric eels, which Ron Fish had helped with, which made it worse. But Frankie had never been this nervous. His nerves felt like they were full of electricity. All the hairs on his body stood at right angles. It was like every single part of his body knew that if this race didn't end with Grandad crashing and losing, then Frankie might just vanish into thin air. As the cars drove up to the start line, Frankie looked up at Grandad with a sense of pride. All these people were here to see his Grandad, to cheer him on, but Grandad didn't seem to notice the cheers. He just sat there with his eyes closed, gripping the ruby suitcase tightly. Would you like to leave, Grandad? Asked Frankie. No, kiddo, I'm okay, but thanks for asking, replied Alfie. And with that, the race began. Crack! The crowd roared as Alfie and Clancy immediately began vying for the lead. It was beyond loud at the track, louder than a fireworks display in a barnyard, and with every lap, every daring move, the noise of the cars and of the crowd seemed to intensify. Each time a car turned through that final corner, Frankie kept looking for the fateful oil spill that would hopefully send Grandad spiralling out of control. But lap after lap, the oil spill failed to appear. Grandad, Frankie asked, you don't happen to know when the oil got spilt on the track, do you? Of course not, Grandad barked, like a dog at a kite show. If I knew that, I would have avoided it in the first place. Of course, Frankie mumbled. He felt uneasy and very, very weird, which is not surprising considering that this was undoubtedly the single strangest moment in the life of Frankie Fish. Here he was, sitting in the grandstand of a car race that happened many decades before he was born, watching his Grandad, whom he was also sitting next to, race a car that he hoped would crash. It was even weirder than the day the yo-yo team came to school to perform tricks and ended up sparking a gastro outbreak. Long story with too many yucky images to go into here. As the cheers and jeers in the stands got louder, Frankie noticed Grandad's eyes were shut tighter than ever before, like he was bracing himself for the impact. It's the final lap of the big race, the commentator screamed excitedly, and it's Alfie Fish, a quarter of a lap in front of his arch nemesis, Clancy Fairplay. What a famous victory this will be. The frenzied crowd got to their feet to cheer like their hero's home, but Frankie's eyes were fixed on that one corner, which was still missing an oil spill. What does this mean? Frankie thought, anxiously touching his face, which luckily at least felt normal. At that exact same moment, the clouds that had been threatening to spill all day let loose. The heavens opened up as rains tumbled down onto the crowd and on the track. The crowd barely noticed, though, as they continued yelling and screaming as if they were competing with the engines of the magnificent cars. But then the commentator's tone changed from excited to cautious. Hold on a moment, folks. The rain is pouring onto the track. Visibility out there must be almost zero. This could sound the death knell for a driver. Hometown hero Alfie Fish is approaching now. The officials should stop the race. But it was far too late to stop anything because Alfie Fish was now heading to the final corner. Water sprayed up from his tyres like he had fire hoses under the back of his car. The crowd oohed and ahed at this latest twist as the commentator continued. Well, Alfie Fish is approaching that final corner, showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, he seems to be waving to the crowd. Let's hope he is keeping at least one eye on the road as he takes the corner, and the crowd suddenly stopped cheering and held its collective breath. For Frankie, almost everything went into slow motion. The crowd waving, curled up race programs, Grandad's car moving toward the final corner. Even the rain pelting down on the track seemed to be descending at a warped speed. Frankie looked at Grandad, who was gripping the Sonic suitcase and staring down at his own lap, his teeth clenched.
Oi!
Don't do that. Frankie put his hands over his eyes and peeped through the cracks between his fingers as Grandad's car spun out of control and slammed hard into the wall. Crash! Frankie felt like he hadn't taken a breath in days. The crowd was eerily silent as debris from Grandad's car was flung out across the track. The silence was only broken by Frankie Fish, who jumped on his seat and screamed, "Yes!" with both hands stretched out into the air. Grandad's eyes suddenly opened as he quickly got to his feet and saw his crashed blue race car on the side of the track. "Yes!" he also screamed with joy to the utter confusion of those around him. "Have some decency," the lady in front with a dead fox draped over her shoulders snapped. "Of course," Grandad said apologetically. "I guess that probably did seem a little, inappropriate." But when the woman turned away, he pulled Frankie into a hug, the very first they'd ever had. "We did it," Frankie said, his voice muffled. Oops. "We did it," Frankie said, his voice muffled. "Where are we?" There we go. "We did, lad." There was the sound of Clancy Fairplay's car roaring as it unsuccessfully navigated the final corner, taking the winner's checkered flag. A moment later, paramedics sprinted onto the track carrying medical bags and a stretcher. "Are you okay?" asked Frankie, peering at the car heap for a glimpse of young Alfie. A stomach-dropping thought had just occurred to him. What if Grandad actually dies this time instead of just losing his hand? There had been enough disruption to the time path that anything was possible. "I'm not sure," replied Grandad, sounding like the same thought had just occurred to him too. Frankie grimaced as he watched Clancy Fairplay pump his fists from the safety of his car. More like Clancy Lowlife, thought Frankie, disgusted. What a sad and ungracious jerk that guy is. Then he felt his Grandad tugging on his sleeve. "Frankie, look." Grandad's voice was hoarse and urgent. Frankie turned to see the old man, grey-faced, staring at his right hand, except that the hand wasn't there anymore. In its place was the hook Frankie had always known. "We've done it," thought Frankie. But his triumph faded when only a second later the hook flickered once, twice, and his Grandad's hand reappeared. Frankie froze, his eyes round. "Hang on, if your hand is flickering, that means the protective force field is fading, which means..." Grandad glanced up at Frankie and almost jumped out of his seat. "Your face," he cried. Frankie clutched his cheeks. "What? What's happening?" Grandad snatched the little mirror from the lady sitting next to him, who was fixing her makeup, and shoved it in front of Frankie's face. "Look." What is going on? Frankie couldn't believe what or who he was staring at. He didn't see his own reflection, but the ghost of a freckly boy with red hair. As he watched, horrified, the boy turned into a girl with long blonde hair, who morphed into a boy with a mohawk, who transformed into a boy with glasses, and so on. "Ah!" screamed Frankie, like an arachnophobe at a Spider-Man premiere. "My face! It's just puberty, dear," the lady said, snatching her mirror back. "You should have seen how my Hamish looked at your age. Nobody told me puberty involved my face morphing from a boy to a girl." Frankie was freaking out. "Why has it turned my face on shuffle?" "I don't know for sure," muttered Grandad as he dragged Frankie towards the exit, "but perhaps the time continuum is confused." He spun Frankie around to examine his face again. "Or maybe it's preparing for a world without Frankie Fish." Oh no.